Hello everyone and welcome to episode 15 of the Layton Fitness podcast. Now in today's episode we're going to be discussing the glycemic index, how it's represented within the fitness industry and how it's almost been misinterpreted and perhaps to the point where people are now choosing carbohydrate sources based on the glycemic index. Now firstly, if you're unsure of the glycemic index, this is essentially a figure representing the relative ability of a carbohydrate food to increase the level of glucose in the blood. Before we discuss how this information has been misinterpreted, I think it's important to note how people are portraying this within the fitness industry. Now, for the most part, people seem to be suggesting eating high glycemic carbohydrates post-workout, and I'm going to explain within this podcast how this potentially is only necessary in certain contexts, and for the most part those who train once per day and just doing weight training, basing foods on the glycemic index just simply is irrelevant, and I'll explain why shortly, but that probably gives you a brief indication of how the podcast is going to be going. Now, it's firstly very important to note how studies on the glycemic index have been conducted, and essentially what they do is they measure the glucose response after a carbohydrate has been consumed after an overnight fast and the individual's just consuming isolation carbohydrates. Now let's just consider this in the real world. With the exception of that first meal of the day, the rest of the day we're going to be consuming carbohydrates within a mixed meal, so with protein at least, perhaps some fats, and also containing fibre. So that again potentially can negate some of the effects seen of an isolation carbohydrate after an overnight fast. It's also important to note that just say after meal 1, there's always going to be nutrients still being absorbed from that previous meal, again blunting the glycemic response. So therefore basing carbohydrate suggestions on the glycemic index just completely ignores context. Just that one theory looking at the study basing a carbohydrate after an overnight fast just doesn't translate to the real world. If we're consuming fibre, fats and some protein, that's going to significantly diminish the glycemic response. Therefore, this already potentially diminishes the glycemic's worth in basing recommendations on the glycemic index. Let's next take a brief look at the post-workout nutrition, nutrient timing. I know I've discussed this in detail in some other episodes, but it's important to go over to look at the reasonings why a lot of people suggest having high glycemic post-workout and in and around their workout. Now, firstly, we need to look at the correct context. Now, if you're a weight training trainee and your next training session is 24 hours away, this is completely different than if you're, say, an endurance trainee whose next training session is within 8 hours. Now, the reason being is speed of glycogen resynthesis is obviously exceptionally important for the endurance trainee whose next training session is 8 hours away. Therefore, carbohydrate type can potentially have a significant difference on speed of glycogen resynthesis and thus whether they recover sufficiently before session 2. However, if they're weight training trainee, next training session is 24 hours away and beyond, which is probably most people who are listening to this podcast, glycogen resynthesis is going to take care of itself by default regardless of carbohydrate type, whether it's high glycemic or low glycemic, with the caveat you consume sufficient carbohydrates. Therefore, having high glycemic post-workout when you're a strength trainee, your next session is over 24 hours, just simply isn't necessary with the caveat you consume sufficient carbohydrates. Now, what about the next statement of, you need high glycemic carbohydrates to quote-unquote spike insulin? We need to firstly understand that protein is also very insulinogenic. Therefore, just having protein post-workout is already going to raise insulin above fasted levels anyway. Added to that, if you have a pre-exercise meal 1 to 2 hours prior to the training bout, Insulin levels are going to be above fasted levels during the session itself and for several hours after the session. So therefore this diminishes the argument of you must have high glycemic carbohydrates after your weight training bout to quote unquote spike insulin. Added to that, it's also important to consider personal preference. Therefore, if you like having some dextrose post-workout or some high glycemic carbohydrates post-workout just because you enjoy it, that's absolutely fine. But just bear in mind it's not mandatory within the context I just mentioned. So if your next training session is over 24 hours away and you're a weight training trainee. Going back to the endurance example, if you are an endurance trainee and you're training twice a day within an 8-hour period, having some isolation high glycemic carbohydrates between session 1 and session 2 will certainly help with speed of glycogen resynthesis. In addition to that, if you're again an endurance trainee, having isolation carbohydrates during competition having isolation high glycemic carbohydrates during competition can certainly help with performance. Now I know this is relatively a brief episode, but I just feel like it was an important topic to bring up and address because there's so many preconceived notions out there about the glycemic index. So here's my closing thoughts and applications. The studies on the glycemic index, they're looking at carbohydrates after an overnight fast and their isolation carbohydrates, e.g. nothing within the meal. This therefore doesn't really translate to real life if you're having your carbohydrates within a mixed meal. And also added to this, there's always going to be nutrients being absorbed from previous meals, thus again blunting the glycemic response. Therefore, I don't see there being a need to place too much emphasis on preference of high or low glycemic carbohydrates unless you're within that above context. Endurance training, you train twice per day, isolation carbohydrates during the session and between session 1 and session 2. However, splitting hairs about the glycemic index if you're a weight training trainee who trains once every day or once every other day just simply isn't necessary, with the caveat you consume sufficient carbohydrates. And as I mentioned above, again, it's down to personal preference. So I'd firstly look at carbohydrates mainly from a macronutrient point of view, in the sense that you need to make sure you're consuming the correct quantity to fit the carbohydrate target you've got before the end of the day. And then from there, for the most part, ideally you're going to be using whole food sources. But at the same time, that's not to say that you couldn't have some quote-unquote processed carbohydrates in there. And the reason why I say that, especially if you're in a dieting phase, it's not to say that having whole food carbohydrates will be better than, say, sugary carbohydrates, but more the point of satiation, just generally how you're feeling. If your carbohydrates are starting to be reduced during a fat loss phase and you just have carbohydrates from sugar, you're going to be absolutely starving, and this can potentially affect adherence, which is one of the most important factors. So that's just another consideration there. But for the most part, choosing carbohydrates based on glycemic index, their GI, is simply not worth worrying about. So thank you very much, guys, for listening. Hopefully this has been informative and you can take a lot from it. If you've still yet to download my free book, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, if you go to Layton fitness.co.uk, you see a tab at the top of the page called free book, and you click on that and you can download that immediately. And that will essentially teach you how to set daily carbohydrate, protein and fat targets, how to set calories for either fat loss or muscle gain. And obviously these are just ballpark figures to work from, but essentially the key with nutrition is essentially putting something in place, measuring your progress, and then manipulating the variables from there, not necessarily the absolute figures you come up with to start with. These figures are going to be ever changing, so just remember that. If you're one of these people who think, oh, these calorie formulas are worthless, they're not, because the key is the manipulating of these calories and macronutrients subject to your progress. That's the real key to progress. So thank you very much, guys. I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.